Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kimberly Begg. I'm the president of the Luce Center. We are a nonprofit organization that specializes in the conservative outreach, education, and mentorship of young women for the purpose of preparing and promoting conservative women leaders. We invest in conservative women because they are the trustees of a free and flourishing America. We are so grateful that you are here with us today. We want to say thank you to C-SPAN for being here. We love it when C-SPAN attends our events and covers our events. And we are so happy to be live on C-SPAN today. I also want to say thank you to those of you who are with us in person today. And I want to recognize a few very special guests. We have a few members of our President's Club here today. Sonia DiCarlo is here. May and Mike Hardiman are here. And Richard Ryan, there he is. Richard Ryan is here today too. And I want to note that the last time I saw May and Mike Hardiman was in Scottsdale because they attended our College Women's Summit in Scottsdale with us. And you all have a booklet on your seats. And this is a booklet that we are sending to all of the college women who are at our summit with us. And you can flip through it and see some of the exciting pictures and exciting information about this really tremendous event. We had 113 attendees with us in Scottsdale and college women from 35 colleges and universities across the country. And our speakers were absolutely fantastic. We had, there we go. You'll see some of the photos in the booklet there. We had Isabel Brown with us and Alex Clark and Liz Wheeler, Erica Donalds, Reagan Conrad. She was fantastic. Katie McFarland, really, really incredible. I know she was amazing. Really incredible speakers. And our wonderful board member, Linda Teets, was with us too. And she said, you know, this summit is going to be difficult for you to top. But you know what? That is a challenge that we welcome. We have a Washington, D.C. summit every summer, and then every fall we do a regional summit in a different location. And I think next year we are going to Texas. So I know May and Mike, you'll probably be joining us again. Sonia, I know you said you want to join us soon, but I hope that some more of you will be a part of that program next year. Also, I want to recognize our featured speaker who's here with us today, Rachel Greszler. Rachel is an economist at the Heritage Foundation. She is doing such incredible, important work. We will give her a proper introduction in just a few minutes. Before we begin, though, I want to take a moment to honor a remarkable woman, Karen Wright, whose name is on the wall of this room, the Wright Room. If you turn around there, you can see it. Some of you have probably looked up at that name at our events in the past. Karen died earlier this month after a really extraordinary life. Karen was a devoted wife and mother, a visionary business leader. She was the CEO of the Ariel Corporation and an American patriot. She was also a woman of tremendous conviction. She gave selflessly to causes that strengthen faith, family, and freedom, including the Luce Center, because she believed in forming the next generation of women who would lead with courage and grace. Everything we do here is to empower more women to become principled leaders like Karen. Her life is a testament to what one person, guided by faith and gratitude, can do to bless a nation. We're honored she supported our work during her life and that this event space bears her name. You probably know that thousands of students, speakers, and supporters have gathered here over the years. And for generations to come, young women will look to Karen's life as a model of faith, courage, and generosity, and be inspired to follow in her footsteps. Now, you all have some materials on your seats. I want to just call some attention to some of our upcoming events. We will be gathered right here in this room every month through the end of the year. Next month, we will have Sarah Kane with us on November 14th. In December, we will have Becky Norton Dunlop with us on December 12th. And in January, we will have G. Van Fleet, whose new book is coming out, I think, 3 days before she's going to be speaking here on January 30th. I also want to call your attention to some of our upcoming programs here. We'll be having our Washington, D.C. Summit, as I mentioned, and our interns are going to be joining us again next summer. And I thought that we had information about when the intern dates were going to be open, but there weren't. So please find Lauren afterwards if you want to ask her when the internship deadlines are. But with that, I would like to ask Amalia Ryland to join me here at the podium. Amalia is a recent graduate of the University of Dallas, and she will be introducing our speaker today. Amalia?
Good afternoon, everyone. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Rachel Greszler, a senior research fellow at the Thomas A. Roe Institute for Economic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Rachel focuses on retirement and labor policy, including Social Security, disability insurance, pensions, and worker compensation. Her research promotes policies that foster economic growth, individual freedom, and long-term well-being. She has written extensively on reforming Social Security and disability insurance to restore their original mission of poverty prevention and to give individuals more control over their retirement savings. Rachel also examines both public and private pension systems, offering solutions to strengthen funding, prevent losses, and reduce the risk of taxpayer bailouts. Her work extends to broader workforce issues such as federal employee pay, women's participation in the labor force, the minimum wage, and paid family leave. Before joining the Heritage Foundation in 2013, Rachel spent 7 years as a senior economist for the Joint Economic Committee of Congress. She holds master's degrees in economics and public policy from Georgetown University and a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Mary Washington, where she now serves on the Board of Visitors. Today, she will be speaking on equipping the next generation, how Gen Z can navigate today's economic realities. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Rachel Greszler.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. I have to say that this is one of my favorite things to do, is to speak to younger generation, in particular younger women. And I wanted to start out by talking about what is unique about today's younger generation. We face in America both a fertility decline as well as a debt crisis. And so by 2034, this will be the first time in US history that we will have more older Americans than we have children in the US. And then at the same time, we're seeing this escalation in our debt. If we compare the per household debt level, and this is real inflation adjusted numbers, in 2000, it was about $90,000 per household. By 2034, it's going to be $350,000. So that's the equivalent of a second mortgage for younger generations today. And so we are asking younger generations to be able to produce more to support an aging society at the same time that they are going to have to pay more to cover past excesses in government spending. So I'm going to talk through a number of things today that's happening in the economy and the workforce, our debt, and definitely want to end with giving you some positive things to look forward to. But I'm going to frame a lot of this in terms of headwinds and tailwinds. And as an economist, I think it was Truman famously quipped, give me a one-handed economist, because we love to say, well, on the one hand and on the other hand. And so we're going to talk about things that are both, momentum, the good things, as well as the headwinds or the negative things. I'm also a runner. And from here, I'll be going to pick up my Marine Corps bib. I'll be running Marine Corps Marathon this weekend in DC. But I've also run the Boston Marathon. And that marathon is unique. It's not just like you start here and do a loop and come back, but they actually bus you out 26 miles away from the city, and you start there, and it's like a straight line all the way into the city. So it makes a huge difference there, whether or not you're going to have a headwind coming at you the whole way or a tailwind pushing you. And I did, fortunately, but also unfortunately get to run in one year when it was just freezing rain, headwind, cold the whole way. But I've also run it better years. So talking about the economy, there are some good things that are happening. Certainly when Congress passed the One Big Beautiful Bill, there are some pro-growth tax provisions in there. It was a great thing to be able to reduce, keep taxes at their lower level for median households. There's some things that will benefit businesses, but we also have some things that are creating uncertainty. And I think that we haven't yet seen employers laying workers off, but they're also not hiring, because I think there's just a lot of waiting to see what's going to happen. And a big thing there is the tariffs and what is ultimately going to be the cost there. And tariffs matter a lot to America because it's basically everybody that they're going to affect. Tariffs are ultimately taxes in the long run. They raise the prices of things. And we're finding out more and more that even these smallest businesses are reliant on trade, both because they're exporting and they're importing parts. And even when we try to protect certain parts of the American economy, like say the auto industry, to be able to produce more cars here, it ends up hurting them as well. And we're hearing those automakers say, hey, we need some relief from these tariffs because they're actually hurting us. And one example here in terms of the protectionist measures that don't end up helping in the long run. So in 1920, Congress passed a law called the Jones Act. And this was originally meant to be a national security bill. And there are legitimate national security reasons to have tariffs and protectionary measures. But over time, they didn't adapt that and get rid of those protectionist measures. And so what that act did is it said, if you're going to have a ship that's going to transport between two U.S. ports, it has to be made in the U.S., it has to be U.S. flagged and U.S. crewed. And so they were trying to, national security, yes. And then they kept it in place thinking, hey, this will just give a boost to the U.S. shipbuilding industry so that we can make more ships here and employ more people. And the exact opposite happened. And that's because over time, when you don't have competition, there's no incentive to be doing things efficiently. And so without that competition, the U.S. shipbuilding became a fraction of global output, less than 1%. We had over 1,000 ships in the 1950s in the U.S., and now we have 100. The employment in shipbuilding has declined by 2/3, and the ships that we build here cost 3 times as much as the foreign-born ones. So that's just one example of how when you and this is a completely closing doors, saying you can't transport anything from one U.S. point to another. So it's a little different than a tariff, but it's nevertheless a protectionist measure that in the long run does not end up helping. That said, there can certainly be legitimate national security reasons to have tariffs. Another big drag on the economy right now is regulations. So this is a hidden thing. We all can see the taxes that come out of our paychecks, or when you go and you pay sales taxes, that's very clear. Regulations are a hidden tax on the economy. It's estimated to be upwards of $2 trillion per year that is costing the economy. That's about $16,000 per household. And it affects workers and wages as well, particularly something like we look at manufacturing. That's one of the more regulated industries. And so the cost per worker in manufacturing of regulations is $29,000. So that's money that doesn't go to the workers, but that the employer has to instead pay to comply with all these regulations. And the smaller you get, the more the costs are. So for small manufacturers, it's $50,000. So by simply getting rid of regulations, you could do so much more to boost things like U.S. manufacturing. But there are a lot of tailwinds as well, positive things that are happening. Over the last almost decade, we've had significant job growth, and we have a pretty strong workforce and labor force out there. There have been more job openings than there are workers looking for jobs, which is a great thing and had never happened before historically. We have seen real wages rise. You might often hear that they're not. And so I did want to take this opportunity to give a little bit of an economics lesson about what is data. And when we hear these things or see figures, you might need to look a little bit further. So some people will say, hey, wages haven't been increasing with productivity. That means that companies are just taking all of these profits and they're not giving them back to the workers that produce them. In the long run, wages should track very closely to productivity. What you get paid should be reflecting what you are creating, the value you're creating. Well, this first graph That's an apples to oranges comparison. It's showing the pay of one group of workers and the productivity of the entire economy. It's not including things like health insurance and other workplace benefits, and it's flawed on many metrics. When you actually account for all those things, you see that, oh, they've actually tracked really closely over time. Over the past 30 years, everybody's wages in the US have grown by about 28%. So it's significant real wage growth. I will note that women have seen higher wage gains than men. Part of that was just a catching up. In the beginning of the 20th century, there were legitimate breadwinner wages. I looked back, my grandmother showed me her document of her first contract that she signed as a teacher in New York. And so it stated her wages and everything. And it said, I attest that I am not married. And if I do become married, this contract is void. You just lost your job. There was a time when women who got married were just expected to not work anymore. And so there has been a catching up of that. And it's kind of leveling out now. And we're seeing pretty similar trends in terms of women's and men's wages. But there's men are a little bit below, and I'll talk a little more about that in a separate section as to why. So talking about what is happening in the workforce. We do have pretty good job openings. We have rising incomes, ample work opportunities that I talked about. But there are also some things that are kind of being a drag currently. And so we have seen a significant decline over the past, both 5 years since COVID, but really going back to the turn of the 21st century in 2000 in the percentage of young people who are working. So this is showing you if we had the same amount of people working today as we did in 2000, we would have 4.2 million more young workers in the economy. Fortunately, older workers are making up for it, but that's a big gap. And if you combine it even more and say like an under 35 age group, we have 5.2 million missing workers, predominantly men, but still a significant decline in women there. And so what is happening that fewer people are working? It can't be explained simply by an increase in college enrollment because that has actually been trending down a little bit recently. This is supposed to be the time that individuals are taking their first steps into the workforce and building the skills that they need to continue climbing the career ladder. I think that we are seeing too much in terms of federal policy tipping the scales towards one outcome versus another. We have hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies going to higher education. And now we're at a point where only 60% of the degrees that are earned have a positive rate of return. And only 6 out of 10 students who start college finish within 6 years. So we're subsidizing something that's often not paying off at the same time that we're penalizing something that is a great alternative, and that's apprenticeships or other types of education, career technical education. They don't get hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies, and instead they get hundreds of pages of regulations that they have to comply with. Things that require such as like one worker for each apprenticee that's coming into the program. We don't require that for colleges to have a 1-to-1 ratio for professors to students. And it's more than just those things. I started reading the regulations and I just said I would give up if I were an employer after 3 pages out of 800. So there needs to be better policies that are supporting these alternative education. Some other things that unfortunately are contributing to this decline is a decline in physical and mental health. Studies have shown that about half of the men who are not in the workforce say that it's because of their physical and mental health. Substance abuse and addiction, unfortunately. And that's another thing where some studies have attributed up to a fourth of the decline in workforce participation, particularly among younger individuals, to this increase in substance abuse and addiction. There's also a lot of regulations, things like minimum wages. If you're in DC and the minimum wage is almost $18 an hour there now, it's harder to get that opportunity to have the first job that leads to the next job. Or certainly if you're an individual with a disability or a criminal record, those minimum wages cut off opportunities for the lowest end, the people who need those first jobs the most. And another thing that is kind of a headwind here in terms of we want people to be in the workforce. In order for people to work, it has to pay to work, but it also can't pay to not work. And we have had a massive expansion in welfare in the US. The federal government alone spends well over $1 trillion. When you add state and local governments in, that's about $2 trillion, spread across 130 plus different welfare programs that just makes it easier to get by without working. You're not going to thrive and flourish, but you can get by versus what would happen if you were actually to go out and to start climbing that ladder. And that has impacts for the federal budget as well. So this blue thing is showing, like, on a monthly level, if you are a median worker, you're actually contributing about $1,400 in taxes. If you are not working and just getting the basic level of welfare benefits, there's far more than this, but you're taking $2,800 of the taxes that other people are paying. So you're basically consuming all of the taxes paid by two workers for one person who's not working. So that's part of the whole budget picture going forward. Solutions-wise, there's lots of opportunities there, just more education alternatives, career technical education, work-oriented welfare. Like, we can have a welfare system, but it always has to be focused on building people up instead of keeping them where they are, and certainly fewer regulations. But there's a lot that's going on that's good in the economy. There's been a huge expansion in family-friendly policies. And this was already happening before the COVID-19 pandemic, but it was really accelerated by that. And so now we see a lot more remote work capabilities. Over just the past 6 years, there's been an 86% increase in the number of workers who have access to paid family leave at work. There's been a massive growth in what's called independent work or freelancing. And so this is a way of working that allows you to kind of be your own boss. It's not the typical report to the job, 9 to 5 one. And this has benefits for all different sorts of workers, everywhere from Gen Z to the baby boom generation, where they can retire and still do something, but have it be on their own terms. Definitely for parents with young children, individuals with disabilities, just enabling them to be in control of their own work. And so this is a great thing. Up to 4 out of 10 Americans say that they have participated in independent work. But there are some headwinds in terms of certain policymakers wanting to close off those opportunities. So the debt is the next topic here. And I see this as the greatest risk that we face as Americans. Yes, we can talk about China, or we can talk about the next great recession or pandemic that's coming. But with our levels of debt, we're at a point where we might not be able to do anything to respond to those other threats. Or at least the cost of doing so would be so high. And you just don't know with debt crises when they're going to happen. But typically they happen relatively quickly. Yes, we have Japan has had like decades of low growth because of its high debt levels. But then you have cases like Puerto Rico and Greece, where in a matter of weeks, they seemed fine, and then they weren't, and they can't borrow, and they need bailouts. And we're the US, and we don't have anyone else to bail us out. So historically, our debt today is almost on par with where it was at World War II. And in World War II, we were taking on this massive debt to save the world from fascist dictators. And today, we have that same level of debt to simply cover our everyday expenses. So that's a problem. And as you can see, going forward, it's only getting worse. The debt is a function of both spending and revenues. Spending is the problem. I mean, yes, we have historically always spent more than we've taken in. There's usually been about a 3% gap here. But in the past 5 years since COVID, and this is only growing, we're spending 3.5% more than we have even historically. And so instead of having like a 3% debt level, we're now at almost 7%. And that's only going to grow. When we look at the percentage of GDP, or you hear trillions of dollars, I know that it often is like, well, what's that mean? So if you put the federal government spending in perspective of a typical household, so a median household earns $84,000. If you're spending like the federal government, you would spend $112,000 every year. You would put $29,000 on your credit card, despite being over $600,000 in debt. And that's just happening every year, and the debt's growing and growing. So as I said, this is like having a second mortgage for today's younger generation. Entitlements is what is driving our debt. So this is the maroon is like autopilot. It's mostly entitlement spendings. It's things that Congress doesn't have to pass a budget for. So the fact that certain things are on hold right now, that's discretionary stuff because of the government shutdown. People are still getting Social Security checks and all of these entitlement or autopilot programs. So back in 1964, only a third of the federal spending was entitlement programs. And now 78% are that. And so we have to tackle entitlements if we're ever going to address the debt. One of those I want to talk about is Social Security. That's what I focus on a lot. How many in this room think that Social Security will be there for them when they retire in its current state? No one? Okay. Yes, so Social Security is facing massive shortfalls. Anybody who is of Generation X or younger will never receive a single full benefit based on the current trajectory. So under current law in 2033, that we run out of the ability to keep cashing in these IOUs and benefits get cut across the board. That's probably not exactly what's going to happen. But if Congress doesn't do anything, that's what happens. I could have a whole talk on Social Security and how we should reform it. But the good thing there, and why I think that Social Security should be the first problem we address, is that actually there's ways to make the program better and to make the economy and to make individuals better by making Social Security's role smaller and by making personal ownership and personal wealth larger. One thing that we did at the Heritage Foundation is look at, hey, if somebody born in 1990 had been able to put all of their Social Security taxes into an account that they owned themselves, what would they be able to have at retirement versus what Social Security will provide? So let's just look at the middle income earner here, Mark. He has an income of $60,000. Social Security will give him about $2,200 per month, but he would have about $6,200 per month if he had saved and used that savings to purchase an annuity, which is what Social Security provides, a guaranteed monthly benefit. Or he'd be sitting on a retirement account worth almost $1.6 million. So the problem with Social Security is that it grew far beyond what was originally intended. It has become a Ponzi scheme. And so since 2011, every dollar that we pay into this system has not actually been able to be invested and earn a positive rate of return or even been set aside to pay for your future benefits. It immediately goes out the door. And that's why it's a bad deal for younger workers, but increasingly even middle-aged workers as well, because it strips you of the opportunity to ever earn a positive rate of return on your money over time. So we have great solutions for Social Security, and I am hopeful that might be one of the first things that we could tackle, and I think would send a signal to the markets that, hey, the U.S. is actually going to address its debt. So the tailwinds, the reasons for optimism, I know I've said a lot of things here that seem kind of daunting, is that we ultimately have to have a smaller government. When you see that debt level, like that's not going to be possible, and we don't want to have 50, 60, 70% tax rates in the U.S. That would just crush, our economy and our growth. So we're going to have a smaller government, and I think that's a great thing because dependency did not make America great, and therefore by reducing dependency, we can actually increase personal opportunity and well-being. Another thing that is positive we have going for us is that despite a decline in workforce participation among some younger workers, we actually have huge capacity to increase our workforce. Both the younger workers who aren't working could be increasing, but also due to increases in life expectancy, changes in the way that we work. Our jobs today are far less physically demanding than they were 50 years ago. And we also have improved health accommodations so that older workers can continue to work longer. And we're seeing that, you saw a boost in the number of older workers in the workforce. So that's a positive thing we have going on. And then artificial intelligence. I know that some people fear that. I've seen categories of there's the doomers, the gloomers, the bloomers, and the zoomers in terms of your attitude. I think I would put myself in a bloomer, optimistic about what it can do with some cautions. But I think that there's great capacity there. Artificial intelligence is just another iteration of automation. And we've had automation, for centuries. Question is it going to be like agriculture where we had, 100+% increase in productivity, or is it going to just be a smaller increase in productivity? Nevertheless, it's going to be an increase in productivity. And what does an increase in productivity do? It makes people's output rise and they're able to earn more over time. It frees up time. And just looking back kind of historically at some of the things, when you think about, we used to have ice boxes. Now we have refrigerators. You had to hand wash things. And now we have washing machines. Well, what did that do to the amount of time that people had to spend kind of upkeeping a home? It freed up a lot of time. I know there's a fear that we're just going to eliminate jobs or even entire industries, but there's also the opportunity to create whole new industries. So when Ford and the automobile came around, there were stagecoach drivers that lost their jobs. Nevertheless, we have this whole industry, not just like the big three automakers who are making the cars, but you have people who are constructing roads and all of the other stuff that goes along with that. And then one other thing I want to give an example on is automation in toll booths. So as I was driving here today, I was, just flying through some of the toll booths. A lot of you might be too young to remember having to actually stop when you got to a toll booth. My sisters and I hated this when we would drive to my grandparents' house because we never knew, was it going to be like an easy 2 minutes or was it going to take 45 minutes that we had to sit at the toll booth? And so now we all just fly through, but it used to be that you had to wait and you had to give your change to the toll booth person who was sitting in this tiny little, not climate controlled cubicle all days and hours of the night, whether it's freezing cold or steaming hot outside. So we don't have that anymore. And those individuals in toll booths lost their jobs. But now they're sitting in climate-controlled, easy-pass buildings and doing jobs that are a lot more comfortable and probably making a lot more money. So while there are displacements in the short term, I think in the long term, I'm just very positive about what the new AI and other things will mean for workers. And I just did want to say also my kind of ultimate comfort in terms of the uncertainty over the future of AI, things like social media and just polarization in the US, is that we were made for work and we were made for human interaction. They provide our dignity and our purpose in life. We won't be happy without them. And I think that we are always going to find a way to keep doing productive things and having fruitful relationships. So I also want to give some practical advice for how you can navigate today's economy. I think that we have seen societies continue to change over time. And the best way to navigate that is to be resilient. Be open to learning new skills and adapting to change. My favorite economist is Thomas Sowell. He's now 95 years old. And one of my favorite quotes from him was in an interview. He got asked, what advice do you give to young Black men? And he says, the same advice I give to anybody: equip yourself with skills that people are willing to pay for. It's a really simple statement. And I would add to that, as what people are willing to pay for changes over time, then you be resilient, be open to learning new skills and adapting. Be wise with your money. It's okay to spend on things that are actual investments. You want to avoid credit card debt, I think, at all costs. Start saving early. It's far easier if you that first paycheck, start putting the money away early, because then you don't actually feel it as much. And the power of compounding over time is huge. I love to have my kids, when their college savings statements come in, to be able to look at them and to see it tells you how much you put in, how much it's worth now. That can mean a lot. And if you're able to start early, far better. But that said, I will say that oftentimes when you're starting a family is the hardest time to be able to save. And that's okay, because that's going to be the biggest, kind of financial stress in your life. And long-term, chances are your income's going to rise over time. And it's okay in those periods of having a young family to not be saving significantly. Pursue what's best for you and your own family, and ignore the outside noise about what you should do, and just focus on what's best for you at each stage of your life. And that will vary as you go through life. I like to say you can't have it all, but you can choose what's most important to you. Take advantage of new ways of work that can make raising a family easier. And another one I want to say is be conscientious. So there was a study that showed a bunch of characteristic traits recently that got some media attention. And one of the scholars that commented noted, he said, "We are witnessing the silent unraveling of a trait that built civilization." And that trait is conscientiousness. So that's the one on the far left here. And the red line shows 16 to 39-year-olds in their level of conscientiousness. And he said, this is the biggest decline of any trait in human history. So buck the trend. Be careful, be disciplined, be persistent and dependable. And just practically, what does that look like? Put down a device, read a book, read an actual long form article, have conversations with people, show up to things on time, especially work. Don't be distracted, be able to focus on a single objective, do things without regard to the credit that you might get from them. and make commitments and stick to them. And lastly, I wanted to show you some pictures here. On the one hand, we have my pretty posed picture of my family that was a Christmas card. And on the other hand, we have everyday life. And I just included this to say that life is not Pinterest perfect. It's beautiful, it's wonderful, but it's also messy and challenging. And the way that we embrace and tackle the tough times will define our joy that we have. So don't cry over spilt milk or spilt flour. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. So interesting. The past few years, I've been hearing a lot about how it's becoming more and more difficult for young people to buy houses. And that's like one of the biggest decisions that you make, especially if you're trying to raise a family and things like that. So I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on this issue, and how can we, as young people, prepare for that?
Yeah, I don't know how people buy houses today. I even look in my neighborhood around me and I'm like, how can anybody afford this? And so thinking like solution-wise and policy-wise, so a lot of what goes into housing is governed by state and local regulations. And there's things like land use restrictions and environmental requirements that can drive up the cost of housing. Zoning things that say like how big the lot has to be, or the fact that you can't add on what's called an alternative dwelling unit that would, allow multiple homes on one property. Things like that all drive up the costs. And predominantly in a lot of cities, we are seeing that it's just become too expensive for younger people to be able to afford to buy a home. And yet you want what you're paying for housing to be an investment, to actually be in a mortgage and something that you own, as opposed to just something that you're renting, because when you can start that early, then you have an asset sitting there that grows over time. So my advice to younger people is, you have to go further out. There are some cities that are doing better things in terms of housing policy, but of course you're going where you find a job, and then you're usually finding the housing afterwards. But bigger picture, that's something to consider if you're, just graduating from college and looking at what is the cost of living in these different areas and how easy is it to get a home.
I have a question. So, what would your advice be for someone who wants to get into investing? What would you suggest for putting your money into? I know you talked about compound interest.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any best ones and scenarios that you think would work out best for Gen Z?
Just basic investing, I usually start off with staying like a broad-based exchange-traded fund. Something that maybe like tracks the S&P 500, or these are things that are like mutual funds, but they have lower fees with them. But if you're like want to get into investing seriously, then you can do more research on certain things. I think that a couple of years ago, housing was a good investment, like land, things like that. Now it's becoming less so just because of the higher costs of those things. But starting basic, and the great thing today is that like we have phones that have apps that you can be following, you can be learning about investments, you can be trading them online. And that's something I talk about with Social Security. A reason that we had this social insurance program is at the time, not anybody could just go out and start, an investment account that owns stocks. You literally had to be on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange to sell a stock. And so we thought that we needed, kind of a forced savings mechanism. It's not forced savings anymore because it's all being spent. But today, it's so easy to be able to just kind of have default things. And for retirement, I recommend just putting it in a default life cycle fund. And so it's geared towards when you're young, it's going to be a more aggressive investment that's going to have higher returns on average. And then as you get towards your retirement date, it gets lower. And that's what we've done with our kids' college accounts. They allow you to just choose like a target date of when they'll be going to school. So at the beginning, it's, more aggressive investments, higher risk, more reward.
Thank you so much for your talk. I feel like recently a lot of friends and family have been getting into Bitcoin. And so I was just curious if you could give us a few thoughts on what you think the risk scenario is there, or the worthiness of investment.
I think my advice there would be to do more research of your own, because it's something I have not done a whole lot of research on. And definitely it's a higher risk and potentially higher reward, potentially, higher loss associated with it. I'd say go out and see what other people are thinking, but there's no guarantees. That's the thing with these investments about like, oh, we know it's going to over the long term be higher or be lower than another one. With anything, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. Yeah, I think the housing is the biggest impact right now. And so there it would be on like the local zoning laws and what can, like the basis of housing, the biggest way to make it more affordable is to increase the supply of it. And so that's allowing more homes to be built in smaller spaces. It's also being able to have the workforce to come in to build things. One other area that can make it hard for families to afford things like childcare. That's extremely costly. And there's not a whole lot you can do. Like we can't automate childcare workers. And so it's always going to be relatively expensive. But there are things like the requirements on in-home care providers, which tend to be 20 to 30% less expensive than center-based childcare. And so this is like the grandma that wants to open up a childcare, or the mom who wants to because she's already staying home with others. There's so many regulations and requirements that you basically have to like revamp your home, and you need the fire code, right? And all these other things. You're already caring for kids that are perfectly safe, but nevertheless, you have to transform your home. So things that would reduce the unnecessary regulations could help.
What would it take to reverse the negative trend for young men that we're experiencing today?
There's no silver bullet. Some of it is the relative decline in things like wages that happened because women's were catching up. I think that part of it is definitely a shift in terms of the expectations for education. Career technical education should not be you couldn't do this, and so you're over here in this corner. No, career and technical education is great, and it's more hands-on, and I think young men learn better in that way. And so we need to be elevating those types of alternatives that are out there. And then just it hits men more, but it's all of society. I think just the trends that we're seeing in the way that we utilize screens is not good for human flourishing. And that's not something that you can just have a law about. That has to be a change culturally. But I think that we are increasingly seeing more people talking about it. And I have kids between the ages of 7 and 17. And I'm hopeful that, by the younger one, there will be more recognition among, my cohort, my friends, and people willing to band together to say, like, no, we're not going to give them phones in elementary school. And just to encourage more of like, play-based childhood as opposed to screen-based childhood.
Rachel, thank you absolutely so much. That was incredibly fantastic. I know I learned so much, and I'm sure we all did. And thank you so much for all your advice to help really protect and promote policies that will give us a lot of room to grow in our individual freedoms and economic freedoms. So thank you so much. Now, we do have a fun little tradition here at the center, if you all know, and if you come to more of our events. We love to gift a tumbler whenever we host a speaker. And this one is a Grizzly partnership. We've partnered with this company, American made, family owned. So they're absolutely wonderful. And it's our logo as well as a quote from Clare Boothe Luce, which I think is so impressive and important, especially in today's society, which is courage is the ladder on which all other virtues mount. So thank you. And thank you all so much for being here. We always love having you guys here at our Conservative Network events. And please join us outside in our boardroom for lunch. Thank you so much.